his analogy was, we're about to see Papa John's and Domino's in personal injury. And Morgan, to a certain extent, has done that. You have Papa John's and Domino's that can order to your house. And you, from time to time, you may do that at a football game. But you probably also have a local pizza joint that you really like and that you continue to use.
Welcome, everybody, to episode number 2 of the Law by Number podcast. I'm your host, Byron Warnken. Today, we have Seth Price. Seth is the founder of Price Benowitz. It's a 40-lawyer law firm, a huge presence in the DMV. That's DC, Maryland, Virginia, for those of you who don't know. Also extending beyond the DMV, and I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit more about that, focused on injury law, focused on representing the injured, of course, plaintiffs, and criminal law, and a number of other practice areas, which we'll also talk about. Seth is also the founder of BluShark Digital, and Seth, I'm going to let you clean this up in a minute if I screw it up here, but BluShark is an increasingly full-service marketing agency serving law firms and attorneys. It's an Inc. 5000 company, and I've sort of watched the meteoric rise. So with that introduction, Seth, thank you for being here.
Well, it's an honor and pleasure. Anytime I get to spend with you is always enjoyable.
Absolutely. I still remember our first lunch years ago, and what a great conversation we had, from jump. And truly, I think of you as an outstanding operator in this and a true thought leader. And when I say this, I mean the marketing and management of law firms. And I think so, and that's largely what this podcast is about, for us is the marketing and management of law firms with a numbers bent. So with that idea, let's jump right in. What are the 3 numbers? If you could only have 3 numbers to measure the success of your law firm, and I'm talking Price Benowitz first, what are they? What 3 things are you looking at?
I mean, look, from my academic point of view, or just, you're looking at top line revenue, you're looking at expenses, you're looking at profit, right? I mean, that's the easy sort of like, okay, but for most people in the day-to-day grind, what are we looking at? Number of cases signed up. Number on the plaintiff side, workers' comp, like in your world, number of ones you've closed, right? And looking at some of those micro numbers, because those are going to be indicative that if you're running those, and the thing about the plaintiff's practice, unique from, we'll call the fee-for-service B2C world, like criminal, family, trust, and estates, is that everything's on the come. So, there are times during COVID where you're like, okay, things are good, stuff settling, but when you saw your numbers go down because nobody was leaving their house on new cases, you knew you were going to be paying the price in the future. And so, always looking at what is coming in the door now, and knowing that even though you're not feeling pain immediately, there may be times where, if for whatever reason, whether it be demand or whether it be marketing is off or something like that, you can really have repercussions in quarters to come.
Sure. So what I'm hearing is ultimately pipeline is a huge thing that you're looking at. And that makes sense. Anything between pipeline, because we got pipeline and the traditional business metrics, any other things that are sort of outside the box or something that you track that others might not?
Well, look, I'm looking at satisfaction of clients. Much harder. Mentors of mine like Andrew Finkelstein pushed me to do surveying of existing clients. The more that can be done, I'd say for me personally, it's a work in progress. We get it. This is going to be one of those awful ones. I can tell how well things are going based on disgruntled client calls. When things are quiet, I know things are good. You get one bad call every once in a while. That's going to happen. I'm sure you've had a disgruntled workers' comp person. Where's my money? But when they come statistically, more than a single, that's when you're like, okay, what's going on, and digging in to make sure that your systems are in place. As you dig further into the numbers, I mean, data is everything. The people who have created the kick-ass dashboards, leveraging whatever software you are using to make sure that you are getting key performance indicators from your staff. All of those things are huge. And that, in one sense, yes, what your top line issues that you're focused on are, but that it's those micro pieces that will give you an indication as to how well you're running, how efficiently, where the problems are. I'll give you one that I love looking at during COVID when everybody got sent home. We used this years ago, something called Work Snaps, very basic rudimentary software that tracks number of hours that somebody is working. Mm-hmm. And, I get a download from this software, and it would come throughout COVID, and I would see something we talked about a lot on my own podcasts, were Jay Ruin on Max Growth Live in particular, was the A players were AA plus at home. They didn't have commute. They love the flexibility. And the B minus C plus players, they were the C and sometimes C minus when left to their own devices. And that I would look at just number of hours worked. And you could see the C people were in the 4 to 6 hours and the A people were in the 7 to 8.5. This is a condensed piece. So that, again, that is part of the frustration of scale. When you have, 20 employees, that means you have a 20th worst employee. When you have 15 people on intake, that means you have a 15th worst intake person. And I've always tried to subscribe to the Jack Welch concept of, trimming the bottom 10% of the fat each year. Something that part of the reason that I'm so passionate about recruiting is not because I want turnover, but because I want the healthy turnover. That if you're in a position where you're leaving dead wood there, it's just bad for culture, it's bad for morale. There are times when you leave it because you don't want to upset the apple cart, but if somebody doesn't want to be there and they're just there because of inertia, looking at those numbers to see who really isn't performing and where you can be. And look, nothing better than coaching somebody up or motivating them or hoping that a phase of life goes by. But, it is, those numbers generally give you a pretty good sense of where you're headed with those people, and then henceforth revenue.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that's one of the things. So when you and I first talked, we talked a lot about marketing. And we talked a lot about how to have success in cases and how to keep cases coming in the door. And you evolved into, and perhaps you always were, I'm not giving you enough credit for that, but, you evolved into a people manager, and you say passionate about recruiting. And that's something that that's the leap that I didn't make, I think.
Well, look, I would say when I started BluShark, I told David Brenton, the president, it's an HR play.
Mm-hmm.
Look, if you decided you wanted to optimize your website, you don't need BluShark, you do it yourself. You'd sit there and you'd become the king of SEO and you could figure it out. It's not rocket science. That said, to scale it is a whole nother beast.
Sure.
Right. Anything doing it yourself is not easy, but I'm just saying, like, if you said, you know what, I'm not going to do what I'm passionate about, I'm going to focus on this. You're smart enough to figure this out already. Get your staff, you do, and you have to a great extent, you have a great digital presence. The piece that I've seen is that in scaling, it is all about people. If you dove into things like EOS, culture is king. It eats everything else for lunch. So the idea being, and I'm not saying I'm particularly good at it. Part of the reason for BluShark's success has been that I've stepped out of the way. My attitude as a New Yorker, if something's wrong, you fuck that up. Can you please not do that? It is the more I've pulled myself out and allowed a team to work properly, the better it has been. And I've really, when I have a wish or a desire, I'll bring it to them and run it through the people who have put this team together, and not, with rare exceptions, then, hey, you don't want to fire this person, it makes no sense to me, but they're like, hey, this is going to upset the apple cart if we do that, fine. And so they get a lot of leeway,
sure.
90%, based on the fact that if they have their eye on that, everything else will follow. And so it is the execution, whether it's a law firm, which I would argue is harder in a lot of ways, or a digital marketing agency, it's about the people who are working together. That, and again, just like you could figure out a single website, it's harder to do it for 40 people. it's one thing to have a single employee. I've talked to you a lot about ups and downs of being a lawyer entrepreneur as you've been, and managing people, having people, break your heart and do all sorts of craziness, that doing it at scale. And I saw this, believe it or not, I saw this originally in the real estate space. If you have a rental property, great. Something's an issue, you deal with it, showing out, pop over and deal with it. As you get to 10 plus doors, almost like a franchise owner, when you move to 10 plus franchises, you no longer have a restaurant, you're not buying a business, you have a business, you have operators and people that manage those people. And two things happen. One, it does allow you to scale and allows you to not be in the weeds and find somebody who's really good at managing as opposed to somebody who's good at vision and building. But the other thing that happens is expense goes up, and it needs to be pro forma, because when you look at your profitability, when it was you and maybe one attorney and maybe then you added a couple admins, like your profitability is pretty freaking high because your expenses were pretty low. But as you layer those layers of management, all of a sudden, because that you don't think about it, well, I'm going to hire 3 lawyers. Well, and you want to go off doing your thing and shooting for the moon or whatever projects you're working on, unless there's somebody to manage that or manage the staff. So it's not just about hiring, let's say 4 plus or minus $50,000 year admin. Now you need a $75,000 or $80,000 person to make sure that the trains run on time, and otherwise your bandwidth goes. So it's figuring out those different layers.
Right. This is a really interesting point you brought up. And I was talking to somebody else recently about, every business, it's managing supply and demand and keeping supply and demand, aligned. And I'm going to ask you the same question I asked them. Is it easier or harder to balance the supply and demand at a law firm when you have 5 lawyers versus when you have 40 lawyers?
It's a great question. And I think it depends in one sense on how you're set up. Now, the good news is when you have multiple lawyers, there is a little bit more. If you have one associate and that associate leaves, that's the end of your life. Right. You're done. At the same time, I've seen stuff within the law firm where, because we're siloed, I don't have everybody doing everything. It is definitely, it is heartbreaking and difficult when certain people leave. One of the things, it's not a hard number, but I try to keep track on exits of people you want to leave versus don't want to leave versus neutral. We have been, I think, very fortunate to have a very limited number of people that we really wanted to keep that have left. And when I look back historically, it is very often people have, I was unaware of it, but they had checked out for a number of reasons. People that I liked a lot, people that were amazing, but they wanted to have their own shop or what have you. And so that often, it is, there's sort of, I think, you never, there, in one sense, you'd like to have everybody. And we have a lot of our lawyers have been with us 9.5, 10, 12, 11 years. We have a handful of people that are really, but the thought that you're constantly looking at it. And so something very interesting that happened to us on our intake team, we've recently gone to a hybrid of domestic and international. I wish we grew to about 12 to 14 domestically. And at the beginning of 2021, I'm like, hey, I think we need to diversify for a bunch of reasons. And we started just to get some, so it was spurred on by the idea that a bilingual button seat in DC could be as much as 70,000 with benefits, right, infrastructure, everything else. And I'm like, there's got to be a better way. If it's Spanish, English versus English, Spanish, like we got to take a shot. And we've had a very good run, so much so that I'm helping to beta test a international staffing training program that's still in beta and trying to figure it out. But I know that there's something there. That said, the piece that I saw was domestically, we lost 3 or 4 people that would be in the category of like, why is this person leaving from intake? Right. And we hadn't really seen that before. We've had people leave before when they've sort of run their course, they're going to law school, bad doobies, but to have 3 or 4 people were like, this is crazy. And I had a manager who was not giving me the straight skinny. I'm like, what's going on here? This doesn't seem right. And there was a good excuse for everything, right? But then I looked a little closer and I was like, these people were making, an hourly, let's say $17, $18 an hour plus overtime. They were making 42,000, and somebody else was offering them 55 for 9 to 5. And I was like, oh shoot, like
Right.
I took my eye off, or we were not in line with market. Market was speaking. And as much as like, I always want to say, I don't want to make money. I may not be able to pay the most, but I want to be, that money is not a deciding factor for somebody leaving. If somebody wants to leave for a penny more, there's not much you could do, because there's always somebody who's going to pay a penny more, which is why culture is so important. That said, it was an eye-opening moment for myself when I saw, talk about numbers, when you see 3 people that were not bad doobies, who were perfectly fine. They weren't rock stars for the most part, but they were, it takes a lot of money and time to hire, to train, to place. You're going to hold on for a while unless there's something wrong there. And it was very humbling to say, wow, market has moved and we didn't move with it. And thankfully we had the overseas component to sort of get us through that period where we could rebuild the domestic team. But that was a scary couple months. So
that was the issue. The issue was the market had shifted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I think we also had some introspectively some poor management that was not ideal, because I think the right management, A, would have had their pulse on that, and B, look, I apologize, I'm doing the brain dump here, but it's stuff that's sort of in my mind I'm always talking about. This is great. Which is, one of the things you'd love to have a relationship with every employee, which is, look, we're going to pay you, we're going to give you benefits, we're going to give you hopefully a home that you like. If something comes up and you're offered money and it's just a money thing, you like where you are, because if you don't like where you are, you want to do something else, I can't do anything for you. But assuming that there's bells and whistles, I can push and say, yes, we can elevate you to a team lead and we can do this. If money is the factor, you'd like to be able to stay competitive, knowing that you don't have a perfect pulse on it. And when you have those relationships, it can be awesome. And I've seen it work both ways. I've had it where people have come to me, or sometimes they don't, and they say, thank you very much, I appreciate the opportunity, I'm moving on. But we had somebody who was a longstanding BluShark guy, and he was paid well, and we'd actually bonused him particularly well. And he got an offer handed to him by a startup, and it was a big deal startup. I would have been like taking that pretty seriously. And he was being offered stock options, but the stock options within reason had a value. This wasn't Google, where they were, going to be, you weren't going to be splitting 10 for 1. And we sort of sat down and said, okay, well, this is your current salary, and with bonuses, you're making a number that is actually what you'd be at with those options by the time you cash. And it was cool. We were able to salvage that one. Was a key longtime member of the team. And that was a great moment. It doesn't always happen, but I'd like to be able to hope that, because again, it won't always be you or me, as you have managers in between, but there's somebody who is in touch with employees. Because look, between all the different online job boards and apps and emails, people are inundated with opportunities during this period, post-COVID or whatever period we're in. And that we are so, and that keeping that door open so that people feel comfortable. A lot of people don't feel comfortable talking about money, don't want to seem like they're nudging you, but how much better would it be? I mean, hiring a new person can be the real cost. We don't even want to get to that number. Imagine what the true cost, whether or not you're using a recruiter. Recruiters are expensive. In-house is expensive. The software to, the Indeeds are expensive, LinkedIn. Then you get somebody in, the training, the downtime, all that stuff. So that if a $5,000 raise makes somebody's day, that's a pretty, that can very often be a small price to pay for the continuity.
Great thoughts. Coming back to something you said, you may have answered one of my other questions. One of my other questions is, you as a thought leader for basically B2C law firms, if you were in a law adjacent business, or you were starting a law adjacent business right now that fulfills a need over the next 10 years, what is that? And I think you said it's international staffing.
Yeah, I think there's going to be, and again, there are people out there staffing, so that isn't it. The question is, how does it comport? The problem is like an onion that I start peeling. because I created this entity, Black Orchid Staffing Solutions, with Price Benowitz, who was our COO, the guy who fell off the motorcycle and basically, disappeared from our personal world for a while. Amazing guy. And what I'm finding is it's more complicated than just the people, meaning it's one thing, whether it's domestic or international, to find and train people. And that's what I'm working on, is what are the trainings that would make somebody more likely to be successful when they got to a firm.
Right.
But when they get to the firm, what are they walking into? Because if it's a firm without any systems, it's going to be hard enough to have somebody who's there that you can say, I do it this way, do it that way. When it's international, those systems are vital.
Right.
And so I host this podcast with Jay Ruane, and he spun out a Facebook group on systems for law firms. And it's taken off like wildfire, because those systems aren't in the firm, and I think that is the area that is ripe, is that we all are running these businesses, and the concept of a law firm in the box, or at least options to be able to put in place, that we're all reinventing wheels, that in a perfect world, you'd love to see here are 3 ways you can do it. Take one and run with it. One of the truisms that one of the people I love in the business space always talks about is that a poorly executed plan, well followed, versus a really well executed plan, poorly followed. If you can get yourself a roadmap, it's not going to be perfect, but at least you're having something for people to then continue to execute on. It's a back and forth. There's no easy answer. And I feel that is the challenge, which is labor is becoming harder and harder to acquire, manage, and retain. And that the systems that are in place or not in place very often are determinative of whether or not that person's going to be successful. So I'm basically cathartically talking out the obstacles of this beta that Brian is working on, which is I can go and find talent. We're really good at that. And I love it. And it's been a passion and machine that we've created to do so. But are you putting kids into a dysfunctional home? Or, are there things, and so then all of a sudden you're like, okay, what do we do to make sure that person's successful there? It's much more complicated. And that similar issues, I can go on, but I've seen this in other businesses and operations. You can solve one problem, but will it really be solved if the underlying
So it's a consulting issue with the firm that is using your services. It's hard to find good clients.
But you're like, hey, I want to sell you a widget. Here's talent. And if you do it, it's like, it look no different than SEO. If we optimize a website and the phone rings and the intake doesn't answer the phone,
right?
Like it's a hole in the bucket. So if I find the most amazing medical records person ever and put them and give them to you, and you don't have a process for them to follow,
right?
It's going to fail. And yet we've done our job. I want to get paid. And somebody say, oh, these people suck. That becomes a definite pain point.
Yeah. Great point. As we talk about systems for law firms, I think about it, there's a real evolution in this over the last 5, 10, 15 years. And it makes me think about the future and where this is going, and I'm thinking about the PI space in particular. Is the PI space going to consolidate around the best run firms?
And as good as I'm humble enough to know that I see what's out there, and there is some amazingly run things. I moderated a panel at NTL, National Trial Lawyers in Miami. It was pretty humbling. And amongst the 5 people on there was an ethics expert from Arizona, where the non-lawyer equity is coming in, Andrew Finkelstein, Keith Givens. And Keith is like, look, you better get on this Arizona bandwagon or you're going to get gobbled up. And Finkelstein, who runs one of the most efficient law firms in the country, Jacoby Myers and Finkelstein and Partners, and has a bunch of other firms, it's humbling when you see a guy who has 12 IT guys. Last I looked, probably more now. He has his own software. He's again, like Morgan or Smart Advocates founder, all these guys create, firms that created their software to solve their own problems. But it was humbling. But what his analogy was, we're about to see Papa John's and Domino's in personal injury. And Morgan, to a certain extent, has done that. Whether we're going to see people with national hedge fund money that go even bigger, quite possibly. He's gone market by market and been a huge disruptor. But he's like, look, you Papa John's and Domino's that can order to your house. And you from time to time, you may do that at a football game, but you probably also have a local pizza joint that you really like and that you continue to use. And that there's a place for both in the market.
Yeah, but what percentage is Pizza Hut, Papa John? I mean, your analogy, whoever those firms are, they've taken 75% of the share. And if I'm overstating it, it's 50%. I mean, it's a big number.
It's a significant piece, and it's only going to get worse with I'm getting calls every day. I used to get them intermittently because of DC, but if Arizona holds up, if this is a real deal, I have no reason to think it's not. Although, if this holds up and the other states, like first, let's talk about like Utah and possibly even California falling, but if they can take the money out, then all of a sudden they'll be producing cases using private equity, using, not schmucks like you and me putting together call centers, but the same guy who's doing, national insurance call centers is going to be running these things. And they're going to be sending the stuff to you, and it's going to start at 40 cents on the dollar. It's going to go to 50. And at some point it's going to be 60 cents on the dollar. Like it's going to keep going depending on where market goes to. And that's the scary part. So like, again, is there enough room for the mom and pops? If you were a limo company, as the Uber app was coming out, there were plenty who thought this is not going to affect us. And now, a medallion in New York is worth 20% of what it was at its height. It's changed the world. So to me, the efficiencies are one thing, and they are real. But to me, is when outside money comes in that is not tied to schmucks like you and me, but is being run at that level. That's going to be a real game changer.
So it's capital, brand, and efficiency, basically.
Well, look, we perhaps sit in our world, and we may be king of the dipshits in our world, but there's good and bad of all of it, right? You look at the private universities. My personal opinion is most of them are atrocious. When your guidance counselor is a sales rep in a guidance counselor wrapping, is not just obnoxious, it's close to fraud.
You said you're getting calls. I can't let that go. You said you're getting calls, and you were referencing about the Arizona piece.
Right. What are you getting? Calls, meaning people are putting together operations where they are using non-lawyer money to market, to gain cases. And they're being run through law firms that are taking a piece of those as co-counsels.
So there's I see two businesses there. I want to know what you think. I see an investment banker for small and mid-sized law firms, both ways, acquisition and sales.
Yeah, and look, I'm starting to see that percolate. Ken Hardison, who runs Pilma, is doing an entire day on the buying and selling of firms.
I saw that in New Orleans, right?
In New Orleans, right.
Are you going to be there?
I'll be there. I'm speaking at not on the buying and selling part, but the other part.
Got it.
So it is certainly there. And I got to say, again, being cathartic, it is humbling. As much as I may feel that I know and understand about it, part of it is as you start to understand it, you realize, where, as good as you and I may be, the just what else is out there and how efficiently it can. When you see some of these firms, Dudley DeBosiер's firm, they're in fact doing a conference on how to up your case. But when you see efficient firms like Finkelstein, Dudley DeBosier, these guys are running shops so incredibly, smaller ones that Michael McCready out of Chicago, who, when the guys who run shop, and again, this is just a couple off the top of my head, there are dozens that are doing a kick-ass job on this and running things so well. It is humbling as as we go through our world, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We're doing our best to get better data, to make better decisions that are data driven by the numbers, bringing this full circle to conclude. But it is definitely, I think that in one sense, you put your head down and you do the very best you can with your world, knowing that there's always going to be a need for a boots on the ground NBA person, or at least certainly hope so. At the same time, not burying your head in the sand and being aware of what is going on to see how you want to be able to pivot your way into such an operation. Absolutely.
And one more question before I let you go, because you're one of the few people that I can ask this question to. The second business that I see is almost an affiliate network of sorts, connecting the ultimate marketer to the non-law firm owner to the law firm. You follow what I'm saying? I mean,
right here's a national presence that you can go to that gets you somebody. And I think they're forming unofficially right now. There are people who are doing it themselves. And it's tough because there are groups out there. There are PI groups, there's DUI groups, and they're great. And that and the Facebook groups we're both in, right? Where people refer back and forth. But 2 things. One, there's so many variables. You need somebody who's actually going to answer the phone. You have somebody who's going to do a decent job, who's going to send you a check at the end of the day, all those things. And so, there are groups and buy-ins, but people are in so many different groups that it's hard to sort of figure that out. But what I don't disagree with your idea and vision, because you're generally ahead of the curve on this stuff, that if there was a turnkey place where you said, hey, here is our best in class person in each market, it doesn't take a lot to replace that. But I get it. There's a place to be able to say to a Utah or Arizona operator, hey, I got you covered. 1 phone call solves your problem. That's pretty powerful. It's not a bad idea.
Well, and the big operators, Morgan could do it right now, to where if he had the technology, he could make anybody a marketer if it was allowed under the rules, and pay out anyone on a case, because you'd have that technology and he'd have the scale to add any incremental case. It wouldn't be an issue, and the systems to track it. So that's something that I'm thinking about in terms of where we go from here. But ever evolving, and it's more complicated now than it was when I met you, 8 years ago or whatever it was. But like you, I think I'm having fun. So
absolutely.
Yeah,
I love it. Well, congrats on the podcast.
Thank you, buddy.
Hopefully get to connect in person sometime real soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here, Seth. Appreciate it.